In Module 4 of our discussion on the Eclipse IDE, we're going to be looking at some things that are very specific to the Java environment. We're going to be talking about the compilation aspects, the debugging features, the work with projects, importing and exporting, and then look at some of the other features that are unique just to Java development. Java uses this concept of incremental compilation, which basically means that when I'm working in the editor, I'm pulling in my source code, my .java files. At the time that I'm working in my editor, I'm also working with the compiler. So we have this incremental compiler, also known as a just-in-time compilation kind of a model. Whereas I'm actually writing my code, it's doing the syntax check for me automatically. So if there is any error, I'm going to see them as soon as I start typing in the code. In addition to this, it's also going to be importing any other class files, bytecodes, any other references that I happen to be making. So when I'm using different kinds of import statements, it's going to be searching my build path. It's going to be looking to resolve these particular references. If there's any issues that occur in my code, it's going to generate a series of error messages. Those error messages are going to pop up in a very special area at the very bottom of the IDE itself, a problems area. I'll see the full definition of what that error message happens to be. So as I'm writing my code, I'm looking at the error messages as they're popping up. And while I'm in the editor, I can actually see the definition and the location of every error message. When I'm working with my class definitions and I start writing code, Java is automatically going to be doing the compilation process for me. So here I have a class definition that I've opened up, and I'm going to go ahead and make a mistake here. So I've got a variable called myCar, and let's say I put it all in lowercase, and I want to get a method called getMake. Another happens to be one like that one. But I've made a typing mistake here, and you can see that an error message has been created for me. So I've got a error message, a little red X that's popping up over here on the left side. It's identifying the fact that that particular variable cannot be resolved. And if you click on that one, it'll actually give you some assistance. So I can see a pop-up panel here. It's actually going to tell me what the alternative solutions happen to be. So even though I have an error, if it can't rectify it, it'll go ahead and do that for me. So if I wanted to, I can go ahead and change that back to the correct variable name, which is the myCar with a capital C. And as I do that, it actually resolves that particular reference, and it will disappear. When you have an error message, you are not going to be able to execute this particular class definition. So if I save it, I will not be able to execute it if it does have error messages inside of it. The debugger is one of the critical tools within the Eclipse framework that we always tend to use as developers. It allows us to walk through our code essentially line by line to see exactly what's happening. So the source is being fed into the debugging process, and in the debugger, which has its own perspective by the way, we can define and perform different things, like we can assign different kinds of breakpoints. So a breakpoint will allow you to stall execution momentarily while you look at some of the content of the application itself. We can look at the individual data values. We can open up a variable. We can look at the contents. We can even change the contents of a data value at execution time. We can look at the threads of execution. So each execution of an application contains its own thread from the OS. We can look at those particular threads. We can stop them. We can start them. We can put them into a wait state. We also have different types of execution controls. We can look at things on a line-by-line basis, or we can jump ahead in our application and view the output. So we can see the console and what the console happens to be generating. So the debugging tool gives us a lot of control over what we can do and how we can view the logic of our application as it's going through its execution statement by statement. I can use the debug perspective to go through my code line by line to see exactly what's happening. I can use it for lots of different types of Java programs, as we will examine as we go through this entire series. So here I have a Java application that I happen to have open. This particular class definition happens to have a main method, so we know that it's going to be executable. And what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to run this through the debugger. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double click in the very first column here on this very first instruction, and I'm going to go ahead and set a particular breakpoint. So this double clicking here is defining a breakpoint at this particular instruction. So when I go to the debug process, I will get control back and I can then control the execution on a line-by-line basis. So from the main menu, my icons, I have a little drop-down option here for the debug choice, and I'm going to say debug as, and right now the only choice we have is as a Java application as a main method. So let me choose that particular option. This is going to launch the debug perspective, so it's going to give me a little message here that that's what's going to start here. So I'm moving out of the Java perspective into the debug perspective. So here comes the debug perspective. So multiple panels inside of here. So the upper left is going to show me the execution threads that we currently have running. In the upper right, it will be any breakpoints that I currently have established. In the center, we can actually see the execution and where the execution is currently holding, so I can see where my breakpoint is. That's where execution is currently waiting for me. Now what I can do is I can simply walk through my execution on a line-by-line basis. So we have a series of controls up here at the top. This one I'm pointing to right now is the step over, which basically does line by line. And every time I click on that one, I can execute one statement at a time. If I want to move farther forward into my execution, I want to get down to where I've got actually some activity here. Perhaps I want to come down to this total vehicle statement. So at this particular point, I'm going to set another breakpoint here. I'm going to double click in the very first column. Got another breakpoint. And now I'm going to use the run option from my set of menu choices here. So run will either go to the very end of the application, or it'll simply go to the next executable statement that has a breakpoint on it. So I'm going to click on that one, and it does take me to my next instruction, my next breakpoint. Notice the full green highlight bar here identifying where execution happens to be. In the upper right, there's a variables tab here, and in the variables tab I can actually see what variables are known at this particular point and what the current values happen to be. So if I don't have any more breakpoints, I can continue to the very end. So I'll hit the resume button. It'll go through the completion of the execution, and I can see down at the very bottom here, my console panel, I can see the results of the execution. So there's lots of abilities inside of the debug perspective for looking at the execution of my logic and look at the values of the different variables and set numerous breakpoints. Within our existing workspace, we also have the option to do a variety of different kinds of imports of different file types. So I'm doing my Eclipse-based development. I've got an open workspace. I have this import capability. One type of import is just from a file basis. I have an HTML file. I've got a Java file someplace that exists in my file structure. I just want to bring in a singular file. Another option is to bring in files that add and augment my build path. So we have jar files that are compressed Java files, or maybe I've got zip files. And I've got some other file types as well that I can simply add to the project path. So they don't actually import into my workspace, but I can reference the various classes. So when I do import statements, I can refer to these particular classes without cluttering up my workspace. In addition, I can also bring in existing projects in a different Eclipse workspace. So sometimes we consolidate things into one workspace so we can import other projects. And I can also import other types of zip files. So later on in our series, we're going to be talking about web applications. These are WAR files, or enterprise applications. These are EAR files. I can import those inside of my Eclipse workspace as well. So I bring these particular components in. I can add them into an existing project, or I can define a new project, but it gives me the ability to consolidate files from a variety of different areas and bring them into my Workbench environment. If I want to do some type of an import into my existing workspace, first I'm going to choose whichever project I want to do the import into. I'm going to right click off of that particular project, and I'm going to choose the import option from the drop down context menu, and that'll bring up this particular dialog. So this dialog is really a series of folders. So we have a generic general folder, and then we have folder breakdowns here on specific types of projects that we could be importing into. If I just want to generally bring in a particular file type, I can use this general folder, and I can look at archive files. So these are .jar types of files, or zip files. I can look for existing projects. So I might have a project in a different workspace that I wish to be able to bring in. I can just look at the file system. I could just simply go through and point to a different area on my drive and import a file directly into my project. So let's say I wanted to choose the file system choice. You'd have this kind of dialog popping up. So I choose file system, I click next. And what I generally have here is a browse capability, so I can go somewhere on my particular drive. I can find a physical file I wish to bring in. Notice down here at the bottom that I've already identified which particular project I'm going to bring that particular resource into. There's a couple of checkboxes below that, and if I want to do some type of an overwrite, if I have an existing version, I want to overlay that one. And once I click on the Finish button, I'm simply going to import that particular selected file into my project. As I prepare my projects for deployment, I might find it necessary to do different kinds of exports. So in the Eclipse environment, we also have the ability to export our files and our projects in a variety of different formats. So one type is just simply as a standard file, an HTML file or a Java source file. Another one is going to be a formatted file structure, so a zip file or a jar file. We also have individual creations of specific types of jar files that contain specific types of components like enterprise Java beans. We can create enterprise files, we can create web files, and I'm selecting some existing projects from which I'm going to be doing these exporting processes. So again, the Eclipse workspace is kind of the center point of our development. It's also the beginning place that I start my process of moving things into a production-based environment. In order to do that, I'm going to need to export my files in a variety of prescribed formats. At some point in the life cycle of my project, I might want to export out the contents of my workspace into a standard file type. So I'm in my workspace. I'm going to highlight and select one of my projects. I'm going to right-click off of that project, and I'm going to choose the export option, which will bring up this particular dialog once again. Again, these are the same folders that we were looking at with the import process. I'm going to export a Java jar file, so I'm going to open up the Java folder. I'm going to choose the jar file option, and I'm going to click next. It's already identified which particular project I'm going to be exporting, and I can drill through this. If I don't want to export everything, I can drill through this, and I can go into any of aspects of the project themselves, and I can look at the contents. In this case, I'm looking at all the different packages that are going to be exported, and if I wanted to, I could even drill into a particular package. I can go down as low as a Java source file and select one of interest, or unselect it if I don't want to do that. I have the option as well to export my source components as well, and then all I have to do is define the name of the file itself. So if I wanted to put this into a temp directory, and I'll simply call it my sample.jar. And once I complete this process, this jar file will be constructed. It's the standard format as a zip file it would be, so you can use your WinZip type tools to go ahead and look at the contents of this file.